Tim, Silvey, welcome to Podcast Radio. How are you?
I'm very well, Graham. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Very good. Where are you? Like in a boat shed or something?
Yeah, it looks a bit like that. This is my garden office, my shed at the end of the garden, which is it does look a bit beachy in here, doesn't it? Sort of beach hut style setup, but it's all nicely insulated and heated, so I'm all toasty.
Oh, that's good. Now, we should say that the Motormouth podcast is usually a two-hander, and I was supposed to be talking to you and your other half, Harry Benjamin, but he's laid up.
He's actually laid up with the dreaded coronavirus, so we're keeping in touch. He's okay, he's fine, but just very, very weary. So understandably, didn't feel up to joining today, unfortunately.
But he is okay. He's not too bad then.
No, he's okay. I mean, he's a young bloke. He's 23 years old. You know, he's got no underlying health conditions, so he'll be back on his feet soon. But I think, unfortunately, this came a little bit early for him.
Okay. Well, at a later date, we'll have to get you both back on to make up for this. But it's all on you now. You've got to hold this together.
Yeah, I know.
Before we talk about the Motormouth podcast, which is all about motorsport, everything, Formula One, everything. Before we talk about that, what's your background? Where are you from?
So my background, I'm born and bred in Surrey, Guildford, Godalming kind of area, and a background. I started out, as many people do, not having a clue what they're going to do with their lives or career, and did uni for a bit. Went to the States for a year during uni to work and discovered that earning money was more fun than
wait a second. Back up. What were you studying at uni that got you to the States?
Well, I was studying business and hospitality management, and it was essentially a hospitality course at a very middle of the road university. But one of the good things was they sent you out for a year to the industry. So I went and worked for Universal in Orlando, Florida, and I had a brilliant time, but thought, I don't want to go back to uni. This is much better. You know, rather than hemorrhaging cash at uni, I decided to quit and pursue work, and fell into recruitment, as I think a lot of people probably do. I was working for Michael Page, and then got offered an internship at a sports marketing agency. And that's where my passion for motorsport particularly, and the business around motorsport really kicked in.
And what was it that set the trap that made you, what you know, the thing that made you go, were you always a motorsport fan?
I mean, I watched it, as many people do, on a Sunday afternoon, watched the F1 with your parents and enjoyed it, but wasn't necessarily a great fan until I fell into it. And when I started in 2005 at this agency, it was with Toyota F1 at the time, who had a title sponsor, which was Panasonic. And I started working on that account. My 3-month internship turned into about 6 years, and ended up being a director of that company and shareholder, and then worked on all sorts of great fun Formula One related content, and then left in 2012 after a bit of a stint in the Middle East with them, and opening up new offices and working at a Formula One track in Abu Dhabi, and then set up on my own in 2012 and carried on from there.
So when you set up on your own, what were you doing in that business? That was the same thing?
Similar sort of things, brand engagement and brand activation in motorsport, and really hard work, good fun. Did some very interesting and varied projects through a company called Silvey Sports, which is essentially just a consultancy vehicle for me to do bits and pieces in motorsport, generally around brand sponsorship. So, you know, Brand X will pay 50 million quid to go and sponsor an F1 team, and I'll help them activate that partnership through marketing and content and digital activations or physical activations, whatever it might be. And I do that through Silvey Sports and an agency called Right Formula, who are a London-based sports marketing agency. So that's essentially the day job, if you like. And then Motormouth came much later and has become the out of hours, morning, evening, weekends, any spare minutes job.
And does it pay?
Motormouth, it's just started paying. So we are making revenue, which is fantastic. And actually the podcast has been a big driver of that. So we're investor backed. We've got about 8 investors, which we got on board last year. But the podcast has really helped us, and that's the thing that's driving the revenue for us now.
So you had a background in knowing what buttons to push marketing wise. Did you have any broadcasting experience?
None at all, none at all. And I mean, I'd done bits of corporate speaking to the extent of, a brand in Formula One that I may have been working with had said, we're hosting a dinner party for 200 of our guests. Can you compare? And I stood at the front with a mic and introduced the CEO of Epson, for example, to the stage, but then got out the way and let them deal with it. So no, I had no experience whatsoever in broadcasting or media. And then Harry, poor old Harry, who's laid up with coronavirus, and I met on LinkedIn because I was looking for someone to host the podcast. Wasn't intending it to be me at all. And we got on well and thought, actually, do you know what? Why don't we do it together? Because we had a nice chemistry. So we did our first episode, I think in about May or April last year. So May or April 2019. And we're up to nearly 60 episodes now and listeners in 35 plus countries. And it's been a real journey. And I've learned a lot from Harry, and hopefully he's learned one or two things from me, but I love it. It's, that side of things is good fun.
And what's Harry's background?
He is more traditionally media trained. So he studied at RADA. And
did he really? Wow. So he's a lovey, really.
He's a lovey. He's absolutely a lovey. And so he's, I guess you could say he's classically trained. But he's done a lot of broadcast stuff, and he's done bits and pieces in motorsport with Formula E. He actually got down to the last 15 of their recent search for a new presenter for the kickoff in Santiago next year. There were many hundreds of applicants worldwide for that. So he's got a bit of a history of broadcasting, has done other podcasts and things. So it's very natural for him, and he's got a very good voice for radio. He was on Hits Radio as a DJ, had his own show. So he's a bit of a natural with it. It comes easy to him, and it's all he knows. So it's been great having him next to me, and we work really well off each other. If one of us is struggling for the next question, or we almost instinctively know when to jump in, and it just works nicely.
That is a good blend, though, because podcasting isn't just about the broadcast side of it. It's about marketing too. So to have to have one who's got a background in marketing and the other one who's got a background in broadcasting, that seems like the perfect combination for a podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worked out well, and Harry is a bit of an encyclopedia of motorsport knowledge, which is useful.
Oh, so he's a fan too, right? Good.
He's a big fan. Yeah, he's a really big fan, particularly of a Formula One or ex-Formula One driver called Paul di Resta, who I tease Harry about all the time. He's a bit of a fanboy of, slightly obsessive. It's disgusting, really. But he knows a lot about motorsport, and it gives a different take. I'm 39. He's 23. He knows a very different Formula One to the one that I know. Mine goes back through the rose-tinted spectacles of the 80s and 90s of that magical era of Formula One, and he's more sort of hybrid engines, electrification, and all that sort of stuff. So it's a nice balance in that regard too. So it bounces off each other well.
So when you sat down then and decided we're going to do a podcast about motorsport, did you have an angle or a niche that you were thinking, well, it'll be like this so it stands out?
Yeah, we did. I mean, there's a lot of motorsport podcasts out there, but generally speaking, bar one or two, they're very techy and nerdy. So they'll talk a lot about aerodynamics and, ground effects and so on and so forth. And that's interesting to us, but it's not what the road we wanted to go down. So we wanted to be a bit more fun, a bit silly. We always sort of positioned ourselves with the podcast and some of the video content that we do together as a bit like the sort of Ant and Dec, just a bit daft, and not take it too seriously.
I've seen a lot of that online, the video stuff. Yeah, it is very Ant and Dec. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's fun, and motorsport is fun, and we want to treat it as such. But we also didn't want to do a review show. We didn't want to just take a Grand Prix and then dissect it and tell people what we thought about it, because that's lots of people are doing that, and it's interesting if you like that sort of thing. But for us, it was more about getting interesting big names on the podcast and finding out more about them as an individual rather than the persona that everyone sees of them on TV. We wanted to really get behind their personalities and bring out their personalities, and I think that's what we've managed to do is find a way to make guests feel very, very comfortable very quickly, and perhaps talk in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily talk during an interview.
Who's been your favourite guest so far?
I mean, we've had I guess in terms of profile, someone like Mark Webber was brilliant because, you know, he's a household name in Formula One, drove for the best team on the grid in Red Bull, was teammates with a 4-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel. And he was fascinating and had some really interesting stories. So people like him are great. And we've had him, and we've had David Coulthard, and Johnny Herbert was lovely, who's, you know, gave us a really interesting insider look at, you know, the era that's gone of, you know, the golden era of big V8s and V10 engines, and his horrific accident at Brands Hatch when he nearly lost his foot. And there's been so many good ones, but even some of the lesser known names, which have been fascinating. There's a guy called David Dicker, who's a multi-millionaire out in New Zealand, who's developing a car that's quicker than an F1 car, called Rodin Cars. No one's really heard of him, but he's hugely successful, very wealthy, fascinating, interesting, quite a difficult character to interview, but good in different ways. And we've had transgender drivers, female drivers, Asian and minority drivers, all sorts. It's been such an eclectic makeup of guests. It's hard to sort of pinpoint one as a favorite. We had Eddie Jordan the other day, who was fascinating. His one's coming out in a couple of weeks' time. So there's just so many. It's hard to pick a favorite. And we've been blessed that we've had so many big names, which is something we're really proud of, that we've had so many A-listers in the motorsport world, and they're continuing to be lined up. So I feel very fortunate.
How'd you get the guests?
Just ring them, text them, email them through their website. Is this LinkedIn.
From you? Oh, right. So you just chase them. You don't have somebody that's a booker. You chase them.
No, we do it. I mean, I've worked in motorsport for 15 or 16 years now, and I know enough people to be able to probably get a referral to someone, or, you know, we'll do a bit of a swap. I'll know that someone is looking for a Coulthard and I need a Weber, and we'll exchange their PAs, or sometimes, as in the case of Mark Webber, actually, it was as simple as going on his website, emailing the contact page and saying, do you want to come on the podcast? Here's who we've had on before. And he said, yes.
Right.
So it's very varied. And LinkedIn I'm always barking on about LinkedIn. It's such a powerful tool for networking, and that's been brilliant for us to get guests too.
Yeah. You have had some terrific guests. Has lockdown made a difference?
Yes. It's funny. It's probably changed the way we'll do podcasting from now on, because
I think it's going to change broadcasting, because a lot of people are realizing you just don't need all this kit. I mean, you probably heard a little while ago one of my cats was whining, but it's not a big deal. People don't care.
No, they almost expect it, you know, kids climbing through the window and stuff. And it's funny. We always used to try and do podcasts face to face, because we felt that's how you got the chemistry. So we would meet up, we'd bring all our equipment. We've got all this, you know, fancy equipment that we carry around with us, lug it all into London, rent a studio space or a small room somewhere, and get the people to come and meet us, you know, as a faff, and transport costs and all the rest of it. And we'd sit there and chat for an hour and then we'd all trot off home again, you know, another hour commute. And having now done it via Zoom, or, you know, whatever platform, it's become apparent we don't need to meet up, and you can still get the chemistry through Zoom. The technology is so good now. So it's better for booking, because you don't have to find a date when you all can go to London and meet up. You have a spare hour, let's jump on Zoom and have a chat. So it's definitely changed for us.
Yeah, I think it's made a big difference to the business of Rode microphones, and some of those people are cracking.
100%. I mean, Rode have just brought out, I mean, there's probably other podcasters listening to this, and Rode, especially the mic I use, which I don't know if is even working because I couldn't get my system set up properly, ironically. But usually I have this Rode microphone, which is the pod mic, which is their new mic, which is like the baby. I guess it's the baby brother of some of their bigger, more impressive microphones, or the Shure SMB7, which I think
that's what I've got. Sure? Yeah, 7B.
Yeah. So it's like a mini one of those, but they for $100, you know, they're producing some amazing kit. So I think Rode are pretty happy that lockdown has happened.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Formula One for a second. I don't know a lot about Formula One, but when it's on, it's a great way to spend the afternoon. And I've been to Monaco, and I've driven the circuit at Monaco in a rental car, which probably everyone that's been to Monaco and had a rental car has done.
Yeah.
So it is an exciting, glamorous world. And it is dominated, though, by three big teams, isn't it? Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull. And it's been like that
Yeah.
for a little while. And I think they outspend like any of the other teams by a figure of something like 3 times as much.
Yeah.
And years and years ago, you used to have these smaller teams used to come along, like your Heskeths and your Stewart and your Jordans, and they'd give them a run for their money. That doesn't seem to happen at the moment. Is there a danger that Formula One could get a bit predictable?
Yeah, I mean, there's several ways of looking at it. You're absolutely right. You know, those 3 big teams, and 1 or 2 that are creeping up. You know, what was Force India that became Racing Point, and next year will be Aston Martin, that's starting to become pretty competitive. Renault are looking pretty good again for next year, and they've got Fernando Alonso in that seat for next year. So there are some teams creeping up, but again, they're, you know, well, in the case of Renault, they're a works team, they're a manufacturer-backed team, so bags of cash. But it does get predictable to the casual viewer. I think the more hardcore viewers have a slightly different take on it sometimes. Whereas, for example, you know, when I look at it, I love the technology behind the sport. So to me, it's a technology and driver race. Mm-hmm. So seeing Mercedes win, you know, 9 times out of 10 and having their inter-team battle between Hamilton and Bottas, to me, is quite interesting because it shows Hamilton's class, that usually he beats Bottas, and that car is so technologically advanced because they're spending their money in certain ways that gets them ahead of the likes of Ferrari or Red Bull or some of the other teams on the grid. So it's a technology race as well. And that's part of the excitement and part of the thrill of Formula One, is that technology showcase. But equally, from attracting a new audience perspective, it's challenging because no one wants to see, the casual viewer doesn't want to see Lewis Hamilton winning every single race. And you just know that if his car's running as it should and he does his job, he's going to win.
Yeah.
However, there's a budget cap coming in next year, which
there is. Okay.
Yeah. So that should level the playing field to a degree, but policing that budget cap is hard. And there's certain things that sit outside of the budget cap, which teams could probably classify as a bit of a grey area. So they could probably still find ways to get an advantage on track. And then in 2022, we've got a whole raft of new car changes, aerodynamic changes, which will hopefully make the racing closer, because at the moment when you look at an F1 car, you've got bits and pieces all over it, you know, winglets and dozens of little sections that direct airflow over the top of the car. In 2022, that's all going. So they're going to go to ground effect, where they use the bottom of the car to suck it down onto the track. What that does is takes away all that crazy aerodynamic bits and pieces on top of the car, which creates dirty air. Dirty air means if you're driving behind and you catch that dirty air, you're all over the place. Your aerodynamics are gone. So this makes nice clean air, which in effect should mean closer racing. So that might make the show more attractive, but time will tell.
I think something that usually lifts the profile of the sport is a character in the sport. And if you go way back to, say, motorcycle racing, you had characters like Barry Sheene. At the same time, in Formula One, you had, say, James Hunt. Before him, you had Jackie Stewart. Some would argue maybe a totally different kind of person, but Graham Hill, someone like that, and then Sterling Moss. The drivers at the moment are a little bit boring. Are we ready for a big personality? I mean, Nigel Mansell was no live wire, you know. But I think the sport just needs some maverick. You agree?
Yeah, I mean, Lewis Hamilton, you could argue it ticks that box. I mean, he's done a lot for the sport. He's done a lot for.
He's the David Beckham, I suppose, of Formula
One. He's a big cheese. Yeah,
yeah,
he's a big famous name, and he's, you know, he's engaging and enthusiastic and has tried to really affect change in the sport and matters that transcend the sport. Outside of him, I mean, you've got Daniel Ricciardo, who's hilarious. You know, the honey badger, he's very funny and always smiling and good fun. But yeah, I mean, you do have a few that are not so interesting. I mean, there's people in the sport still who have effectively bought their way in.
Okay.
You know, so, you know, you look at certain drivers up and down the grid who are primarily in that race seat because they've paid to be in that race seat, whether that's family money or sponsorship backing, which is not unusual. Ayrton Senna was a paid driver. He just happened to be a really, really talented one.
Yeah.
So Yeah, I agree. I think that we are kind of crying out for big personality. I think for the younger audience, it's there because you've got the likes of Lando Norris, the British driver, and Charles Leclerc, the Monegasque driver, and Carlos Sainz, and one or two others who are all on Twitch, who are all doing esports and sim racing and are engaging with the younger audience and doing some really fun things with the younger audience. And perhaps people of my generation and up don't care so much for that kind of thing. You know, they don't watch stuff on Twitch, they don't stream sim racing, and they don't see people like Charles and Lando being fun and engaging. But if you follow Lando on Twitch or on his social media, or Charles Leclerc, I mean, they've done some brilliantly engaging and fun things, full of personality that very much appeal to that younger generation. But you certainly you don't have the likes of a James Hunt, you know, tearing it up every weekend outside of probably Kimi Räikkönen, who's sort of the last of those who loves a beer, you know, and doesn't really care whether it's a Saturday or Sunday or a, you know, breakfast on a Monday. So I agree, but I think it's a changing world, isn't it? And you know, there's some young guns coming through who, for that generation, are big personalities.
Yeah, which would help your podcast too. If you get
yeah, if we could get them. F1 drivers are tough to get.
They are.
Yeah, so and we've had a lot of ex F1 drivers. I think we're yet to get a current one. We've had a lot of Formula E drivers, but no Formula One driver yet. But we plug away on that one.
Formula E's going from strength to strength. You see a day coming when Formula One will be all electric cars?
No, I don't think so.
You think it will always be for pure... I mean, because we still have horse racing and we don't have horse-drawn things anymore. You think it'll be that kind of thing?
I think so. I mean, Formula E have been quite clever. They got a contract for... they have exclusivity for 25 years on single-seater electric racing cars. So Formula One couldn't go electric even if it wanted to. But I don't think they want to. They're two very separate things. Formula One is still regarded at the moment as the pinnacle of racing. And despite all the electrification worldwide and government's plans to, you know, reduce their carbon footprints and introduce EVs across our road network, it still feels like there's a place for this sort of hybrid turbo that Formula One produces. Even if it becomes a bit of a throwback, you know, series, it can't really lose that visceral power that you get from a combustion engine, even though now it is very much a hybrid.
I wonder what difference that will make to the works teams, because if, like, for instance, say Mercedes are forced to make their production cars electric, which they will be soon, you know. Because it does. You know, let's face it. Formula One sells cars. You know, a guy driving a Mercedes may feel like a Formula One driver on his way to work one day because he's driving a Mercedes, and I wonder if that will have an effect on it.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's fascinating because Formula E, we're going into its 7th season now, so it's becoming more well established, and it's done brilliantly for certain manufacturers. But interestingly, manufacturers are now pulling out. So, you know, there's one or two that have said, you know, as far as we're concerned, Formula E's done its job. You know, it's told our story about electrification for us as a manufacturer. So we're done. We're done with that.
Wow.
So, you know, it's interesting to see what will happen next. You know, whether it's, you know, is it going to be hydrogen that you know, there'll be some new hydrogen based series that will take over, you know. But I think Formula One, as far as I can tell, and from the people I speak to, they seem to feel it's safe and it's secure, and it while it needs to adapt and change, it's still got its future cemented as the pinnacle of motor racing.
Is it safe though? Because we had that horrific crash the other week. I forget the driver's name. You know, where he's there. When he's in a ball of fire. Now, if he was in an electric car, you know, he wouldn't have had that issue.
True, but I mean, it's testament to the safety of Formula One now that he came out of that pretty much unscathed. I mean, he hit that barrier.
About it, wasn't it?
Yeah. He had some burns to his hands, which, you know, he touched something and it burnt through the gloves. He damaged his foot a little bit trying to extract himself, but the halo that the Formula One car's on these days probably saved his life, and the fireproof clothing that they wear is so advanced now that he was sat there for 27, 28 seconds in a ball of fire, and came out with his suit looking almost brand new. And you know, amazing that Formula One has got to a point where that you can have an accident like that with a guy sitting in a fireball for half a minute, and he effectively just walks away with burnt hands.
And not only that, the speed he hit that barrier at head on, how he survived that. You know, you see Senna's crash didn't look anywhere near as bad as that when you see the actual crash, and it took him out. You know, so the safety has come a long, long way. So it's good to see. What podcasts inspire you then? What podcasts do you listen to? And I'm talking motorsport and non-motorsport because you know your podcast is an interview. It's an interaction as much as it is about sport. What podcasts inspire you?
I mean, we were the one that actually set me on the path was a podcast in the States. It is a motorsport podcast called the Parc Ferme.
What's it called?
And we actually the Parc Ferme, and we actually had their host on our show because he didn't know. I'd been listening to his podcast for maybe a year and a half, 2 years. And I was always a big fan of it. It was my favorite motorsport podcast above all the mainstream ones, you know, the big ones that are out there. And I listened to him and I thought, this is so good. And we don't have, I didn't feel like we had that kind of fun. It was a really fun podcast. I thought we'd need that in the UK. And he was the inspiration behind starting the Motormouth podcast. And we told him that live on our show, and he was sort of blown away by it. But he's done incredibly well. He's in America and has done maybe 600-700 episodes. Very funny. He's more of a review type show, but they do it in a really lighthearted, fun way. So he was one that really got me going. And then I listened to, I'm a serial podcast listener. One of my favorites is How I Built This by Guy Raz, where they interview, you know, people like the founders of Airbnb and, you know, big startup organizations. They'll get the founders of that and interview them for an hour and deep dive into how their business operates and things like that. I like those sort of business-esque podcasts, whether it's the Side Hustle podcast or Lewis Howes, those sort of inspirational business-led podcasts are something that I'm really keen on.
And how did you get into podcasts? Because for me, it seemed like a natural thing. I was working in radio. I started off on the radio in Australia before there was, you know, before people had internet. Certainly didn't have audio on the internet. And I used to, as a radio broadcaster, I used to send away to a company called California Air Checks, who would send you a cassette of American disc jockeys, and they would record them off the air and then cut out the music. Or as my wife used to say when we listened to in the car, they've cut out all the best bits. But that was what I used to do. And after a while, I got to be a fan of certain broadcasters, Kid Craddock in Dallas, the Greaseman, wherever he hadn't been fired, and Howard Stern, obviously, and all these different American broadcasters, just to get some, because I was very new to radio at the time. And then when the internet came along, I started listening to them on their website and their listen again thing. And then pretty soon, those broadcasters turned their listen again things into podcasts. I think Kid Craddock was the first one to do that. And so then after a while, oh, wow. And then your phone comes along. So for me, it seemed like a natural thing as listening to broadcasters and see how they, you know, just actually steal ideas. How did you come to podcasting cold? Because that's the experience I've not had. It's kind of always been there for me. First on cassette, then online, having to download it, and now with podcasts.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, starting a podcast cold was an interesting experience and a nerve-wracking one. You know, that the first time that I interviewed someone, we picked fairly strategically our first guest, a guy called Callan O'Keefe, who at the time was racing for Fernando Alonso's team. He has his own team called FA Racing. But Callan was, it's not fair to say he was grassroots. He was at a very high level, but he wasn't necessarily a household name. So, you know, we cut our teeth with him.
And how did you go? How did you think you went?
At the time, I thought it was great. I was like, this sounds brilliant. And then when I listen to it now, I cringe because, you know, we had really basic equipment, which is fine. You know, you do that when you start out, don't you? But it was very basic equipment in a glass walled room, which was incredibly echoey. And we didn't really have any sort of microphone technique, or, you know, we were all over the place, but the content was all right.
Yeah.
And the second one, we had a Kelvin Fletcher, Emmerdale's Kelvin Fletcher, who played Andy Sugden in Emmerdale for years. and then won Strictly Come Dancing. He was our second guest, but he's also a racing driver, which not many people know. So he's a British GT champion.
Wow.
So we had him on, and we did that in a studio in Manchester. And then I was like, okay, now this sounds much better. I get this now. We need to upgrade our equipment. The third we had with Perry McCarthy, the original Top Gear Stig, which again, we were back to our crap equipment. Gradually over time, we learned what worked, and I purchased a couple of bits and pieces which really changed the game in terms of the quality of our recording.
What were those bits and pieces? Because there might be like new podcasters listening.
So I bought, I upgraded the microphone to the pod mic, and I coupled that with the Rodecaster Pro.
The Rodecaster Pro. It's the industry standard now, isn't it? It really is.
It's so good. We've had it for a little while now, and I've recommended it to so many people. And it's, you can program jingles, sounds, you can control 4 tracks, you can make phone calls from it, you can bring people in live to shows. I mean, it's just a brilliant piece of kit. And that, coupled with better microphones, has really been a game changer for us. And just editing better, having a better jingle, better intros, better outros, and cementing our sort of run of show. We've got a sort of set format that we follow that's very second nature now. Yeah. And we know which parts I do, which parts Harry does. We have a quiz, and it's all structured.
Well, you're giving it enough. When you listen to it, though, sometimes people, and this radio is very guilty of this, the structure becomes like, the format becomes so important to the people in charge, because a lot of the people in charge haven't got personalities and failed as broadcasters, and that's why they're in charge of radio stations. Yeah. And they can measure whether you go off-piste on the format, but they can't measure whether something's really good or not, because they've no idea. And so that becomes the most important thing. And sometimes it strangles shows. You've got to give shows, you've got to have a format, and you have to have a structure, but you've got to give it air and let it breathe. You really do. And yours really does. So you've managed to get that balance spot on.
Oh, thanks. I mean, what we've tried to do, the way we do it is, if this helps anyone that's listening and that's starting out, is we have a scripted intro, which is short, very short, and it tends to be a bit silly. We'll often chuck a few random facts about Essex, where Harry's from, and it's a bit weird and random. And then we have a scripted intro to the guest, and all of that takes maybe 3 minutes. From then on, it's entirely how the conversation goes. A bit like this, you just see where the conversation goes. But we do have prompts. We have a list of statistics about the guest, and we have a list of questions. But whether we use any of those depends on the flow of the conversation. So sometimes we barely even touch it, and we just chat. And then after about 30-35 minutes, or depending how the conversation's going, we chuck in the quiz, which is always good for a laugh. And then after the quiz, we tend to ask a bit more silly stuff. So it tends to go script, serious questions, quiz, silly questions, and then our final 3 questions, which are the same for every single guest, and toss up different answers every time.
The podcast is called, is it Motormouth or The Motormouth?
Well, it's the Motormouth podcast, but I think if you search Motormouth or the Motormouth podcast on your chosen podcast player, you'll probably find us. And it's all part of a wider thing, which is a website and an app that you can download on Apple and Android, which is also called Motormouth, where you can.
What's the website address?
www.motormouth.club.
.club, motormouth.club. That's where you'll get everything there. And you've got the archives of the podcasts up there too?
Yeah, the podcast is all up there as well, so you can listen direct through the website or through Google or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. We're pretty much everywhere. So yeah, it's easy to find.
What's next? Where are you taking this thing?
Well, we've got we're in season 5 now. Season 6 kicks off early next year. And we just want to make it as big and fun and exciting as we possibly can in terms of the podcast. Keep getting bigger and bigger guests, which is getting harder and harder because we've been blessed with so many good guests. I think we round out season 5 with Jake Humphrey.
Okay, because he's got his own podcast, hasn't he? So
he's got a very successful podcast. Yeah. So we round out with him, and then we move into season 6. So we've got to keep upping the game and get bigger and bigger guests. So I think the future for us is, once we reach a sort of critical mass of listeners, is probably saying to the F1 fraternity, the current F1 fraternity, look, we've got an audience here, come and talk to us. So, we want to get the current F1 grid on the show, and IndyCar and, all the other big series. So I think the next step for us is just get bigger and bigger guests and keep growing, and reach as many people as we can.
Great. Well, great to talk to you. Thanks for telling me about the podcast. It is a terrific podcast, even if you're not really that much into motorsport. It's about people and their stories and their achievements, and it's funny too. The two of you really get on well.
Thank you. Yeah, 100%. If you're not a motorsport fan, don't let that put you off. I mean, we've had some really interesting chats with the likes of Freddie Hunt, James Hunt's son, the former Formula One world champion, big character in the sport. His son Freddie is identical to James Hunt in every way, and a very interesting and emotional character. And we talk about all sorts of things, from mindfulness and mental health. And we had Charlie Martin was a fascinating one, who was a male racing driver that then went through the transgender change and became a female. And we talk in depth about that whole transition and how that's affected her and her life and her thoughts and her personality and even her driving style. So there are some really interesting ones.
Can she reverse? I mean,
Well, she used to be able to. She can't anymore.
Right. Okay. There you go. It was waiting for it. It was out there asking for it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we've had people like that, and Willie T. Ribbs, who's a race pioneer.
There was Adam Carolla did a documentary on him. Did you ever watch that?
Yeah, so he's got a show called Uppity on Netflix, all about Willie T. Ribbs and his experience with
NASCAR
race. Yes, that's right. And he was super interesting, and he ended up in the Indy 500, which was his goal in IndyCar. But his whole story is mad, and he knows, he was friends with Muhammad Ali, and so we talked to him about race and that movement of Black Lives Matter. And
well, he had some issues, didn't he, in IndyCar, because he was the only black driver in what is seen as such a redneck sport. Yeah,
he had major issues, and there are still issues in that sport now.
Okay.
So there's lots of interesting things outside of motorsport. So I'd encourage everyone to go and give it a listen, and I'm sure you'll find something there that you like.
Tim Silvey, thanks very much for your time, and say hi to Harry. We'll have to do this again with the two of you. So please stay in touch, and we'll see where the podcast ends up on the Pod 20. The Pod 20 is on podcast radio every Friday at 5 p.m, where I count down the top 20 podcasts and play clips from these interviews as we go through, as the podcasts show up in the chart. So I hope you're near the top when we get onto it.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me on, Graham.
Cheers, Tim. Thank you. Motormouth.
Cheers, then.